Welcome back to a new episode of Wheels of History. Before we dive into the story of today's protagonist, we invite you to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more videos like this one. Today we return to a precise date, the date that forever changed the history of competitive motorcycling. September 26, 1957. There are dates that split history in two. September 1957 was one of them, a bolt from the blue. Gilera, Mondial, Moto Guzzi. Three names etched in the stone of motorcycling history, three beacons in the dark sea of Italian passion, decided, in unison with eerie synchronicity, to shut down their engines. Not because of a breakdown nor a technical failure, but by choice, by will. The reasons, officially economic, but numbers alone don't tell the whole story. Behind that act lay a mosaic of pressures, fears, industrial strategies, and perhaps a short-sighted vision of what the future could have been. Some say the idea took root in the mind of Count Domenico Augusta, the brain and soul of MV, who cast the stone and then pulled back his hand. That infamous non-aggression pact, so often debated, never fully revealed, opened the gates to the Eastern giants, who in the decades to follow would not only dominate the racetracks, but also conquer the markets. And what if that pact had never existed? What if our champions had kept racing, kept innovating, kept igniting the circuits of the world? History, perhaps, would have taken another turn, but let's go back to those days. Italian racing was already in mourning. After the tragedy of the Mille Miglia and the farewell to the Motogiro, all road competitions were wiped out in one swift stroke. The Milano-Taranto, mother of all endurance races, was stopped before it even began. In the midst of this already grim landscape came the news of the withdrawal, a renunciation that didn't feel like fate, but like a calculation. A blow dealt not by misfortune, but by reason. Perhaps disaster is too strong a word, but ask those who once dreamed in front of race posters, who built exhausts in their garages, who saw in the Italian champions not just athletes, but heroes. That 1957 was more than a farewell, it was the end of racing's innocence. To soothe, if only briefly, the cruel wound inflicted upon the soul of Italian motorcycling came the victories. And what victories, my friends? Mondial, with the feline grace of Tarquinio Provini in the 125 and the technical elegance of Cecil Sanford in the 250, danced like a symphonic orchestra on tracks bathed in sunlight and burnt oil. Moto Guzzi dominated the 350 with the Australian Keith Campbell. A knight from afar, while in the premier class, the queen of them all, the 500. It was Libero Liberati, a name already epic in itself, who triumphed astride the four-cylinder Gilera, a monster of mechanical perfection and competitive fire. It was an Italian summer of engines and glory, culminating in the triumph of the nation's Grand Prix at Monza. 100,000 beating hearts, voices hoarse with passion, flags waving like prayers to the sky. And then, the chill. On September 27th, with the blunt force of a telegram announcing the end of an era, came the news that plunged the two-wheeled nation into mourning. Gilera, Mondial, Moto Guzzi, all out. Not by defeat, but by decision. A collective suicide at the very peak of their strength. But there's more, and deeper still. Back then, the regulations were a blank canvas for genius. No bureaucratic cages except the announced end of full fairings in favor of exposed wheels. It was an era when dreaming of an 8-cylinder wasn't utopia, but a concrete challenge, one that Moto Guzzi had already dared to face. The atmosphere was different, untainted by media cynicism, unsullied by technological overindulgence. The audience, perhaps naive but unquestionably devoted, lived racing as one lives faith, with the soul stretched to its limit, with the heart clinging to a number, to a helmet, to a roar. The riders weren't just athletes, they were heroes, the motorcycles, mechanical relics of a modern epic. Mondial, with its silver and sky blue gleam, was more than just a motorcycle. It was Celeste Ada, so named by the poets of the paddock, by mechanics in love with their craft, by reporters who still knew how to write with their hearts. The Gilera twin-cylinder, rare and precious like a dream apparition, was called the Whitefly. Ray Ams Norton, fierce and tireless, earned zoological nicknames. Some called it the Anteater, others the Hammerhead, and each swore they were right. Graham's AJS was the porcupine because of its protruding fins, and the 350 Guzzi, solid, wiry, almost rough to the eye, unquestionably earned the popular and folksy name of Ossobuco. But for the four-cylinder Gilera, there were no nicknames, only silence and devotion. It was enough to watch it at rest, under the Monza sun or at dawn in Spa, to feel a respect mixed with awe settle over you. And when Geoffrey Duke mounted it, elegant and unflappable like a British officer at war, even the roughest voices fell silent. People would kneel, yes, and that is no metaphor. Back then, motorcycling was myth before market. The public gave names, not codes. Motorcycles had souls, not alphanumeric tags. The rider's roster was the beating heart of the race, not a paddock brochure. The fastest qualifying time meant less than the grit a rider hid inside, ready to explode in the race when it truly counted. That era was not just magnificent, it was unrepeatable. And this can be said even stripped of nostalgia, looking at the facts in their naked truth. So the question that still scratches at us today, why that Pact? Why turn off the engines? Just when the road seemed finally open and the crowds lining the tracks grew larger every year. Why, at the very moment of greatest glory, decide to leave the field like generals tired of winning? What did those leaders see beyond the curve of the future? Did they fear the rising cost of technology? Or worse, a world changing too fast, where racing was no longer enough to sell dreams? And if they had resisted, if Gilera, Mondial and Guzzi had gritted their teeth and pushed forward instead of retreating with honor and doubt, what would have happened when the Japanese, then still unknown, stepping lightly, began to land in Europe with their ruthless method, industrial vision and absolute faith in speed as a tool of conquest? Many answers still hang in the air, light and elusive like oil trails on asphalt. Let's put aside the official version for a moment, the epitaph penned with diplomatic hand, and try to dig deeper with the honesty memory demands. Why truly did Gilera, Mondial and Guzzi step back precisely when the whole world was watching their exploits with eyes as wide as headlights? Costs, certainly. The first point, inevitable. Racing, like every extreme art, consumes resources like a ravenous flame. And revenues? They didn't match up. Sport ignited hearts and headlines, but wasn't enough to keep the assembly lines turning. The commercial reality, grayer, more concrete, told a different story. The Italy of the economic miracle was betraying the motorcycle to chase the automobile. Where once a motorcycle represented independence, pride, even seduction, now it was seen as the vehicle of the poor, the last, the not yet arrived. Faced with this cultural shift, the manufacturers did not respond with dreamlike models, nor did they attempt the card of allure. On the contrary, they chose the low road, the compromise. They built economical, stripped-down, utilitarian two-wheelers in a vain attempt to hold back the masses fleeing toward the steering wheel and the car door. Thus, the motorcycle lost its charm, lost its symbol, lost its soul. A slow slide that, except for a few exceptions, rendered it almost invisible in the landscape of Italian desires for much of the 60s. Until, irony or justice of history, the very Japanese, those who were meant to be kept at bay by the famous Pact, came to remind us how to build a dream: large displacements, refined aesthetics, tangible quality. But behind Gilera's decision lies a pain that goes beyond the balance sheet, beyond strategy, beyond logic. Engineer Sandro Colombo, a man of genius and craft who was sporting director for years and then the mind behind the modern rebirth of the Saturn, recalls, yes, costs were a problem, but the real wound, the one you couldn't see in the accounts, was in Giuseppe Gilera's heart. The blow that broke him was the death of his son Ferruccio. He was 26 years old. He passed away in October '56, taken by viral hepatitis after a visit to the Argentine factories near Buenos Aires. He was his heir, his future. He was the blood of Gilera itself. After that loss, nothing was ever the same. And so, how can one truly blame that withdrawal? When a father loses a son, can he still speak of victory? Perhaps more than an industrial decision, it was an inner funeral. A glance to the sky and a farewell, not only to racing, but to a dream that had lost its guardian. Less ambiguous, indeed I would say crystal clear, were the reasons that pushed Mondial to lower the curtain on its sporting arc. Pierluigi Boselli, scion of Count Giuseppe, a passionate mind and patron of that brief but shining racing era, often recalled with a note of yearning his father's words. In the end, it was numbers. Cold, ruthless, resistant to romanticism. The commercial direction, then led by Carlo Boselli, Giuseppe's brother, touched the sore spot. The expenses incurred to keep the flag flying on the track indeed generated clamour and prestige, but did not translate into sales, especially abroad, where Mondial paradoxically exported almost nothing, a tragic contradiction. At home, production remained artisanal, limited to a few niche examples, far too little to justify a financial commitment bordering on heroism. In fact, it was the golden toy of Count Boselli, a utopia fueled more by heart than by wallet, destined to crash against the wall of industrial reality. Moto Guzzi's situation was far more complex. An ancient and glorious brand, legendary since the dawn of heroic motorcycling, it boasted a solid reputation even beyond borders, thanks to a refined range and a quality that bordered on monastic perfection. And yet, even in Mandello del Lario, the wind had changed. This is testified by Giulio Cesare Carcano, a brilliant engineer and father of the mythical 8-cylinder, then director of experiments and studies. He told how, for some time, the flame of passion had been dying in Carlo Guzzi's heart, who, after the last spark, the supercharged 3-cylinder of 39, had stepped aside, leaving it to him, Todero and Cantoni to carry on the adventure. But without the support of ownership, the fate was sealed. Only President Parodi expressed sincere regret. It seems that the idea of the joint abstention sprouted in a private conversation between Gerardo Bonelli, CEO of Guzzi, and Joan Ermilio, administrative director of Gilera. A few words, a look of understanding, and fate was decided. On Monday, September 16th, upon returning to the factory after the Modena race, where Montanari and Colnago had claimed the national titles aboard the glorious 350 and 500 models, Carcano was summoned. He was informed of the decision. Moto Guzzi was withdrawing from racing. The surreal news was made public only 11 days later. As a meager consolation, he was entrusted with the direction of design, a bitter reward, dust swept under the rug. It was, more than anything, an institutional placation, like giving stripes to a soldier coming home with no more wars to fight. And yet, for 1958, the Mandello workshops had heated up like never before. They were working on new fairings, shaped with the finesse of an aerodynamic Botticelli. A decomposable crankshaft was already under study, forged according to the strict Germanic principles of Hirth, with tolerances that seemed surgical. The lubrication system was to be revolutionized, cooling enhanced, the frame modified at critical points. All to squeeze from the legendary 8-cylinder and unheard-of power, 80 net horsepower compared to the initial 62, a mechanical battle cry. But that's not all. A new double overhead cam single-cylinder engine was simmering, to be used on short circuits, where technique sharpens nerves and the engine must bite immediately, without the luxury of lyrical timing. But the symphony was interrupted. The riders were dismissed with a shrug. The skilled personnel, true treasures of the Italian industry, redirected to less heroic sectors. Racing was ending. The legend, no. Despite the vow of chastity, some extramarital adventures were allowed. Gilera and Guzzi took refuge in regularity, a noble discipline, though less photogenic, where victories still came, but without trumpet fanfare. Then, in '63, a flicker. Gilera opened the vaults and entrusted some of its 4-cylinder bikes to Geoffrey Duke, who passed them to Minter, Hartle and Red. Brave races were seen again. Roars reminiscent of days gone by were heard once more. But it lasted little. The flare quickly died out like candles in the pits at dusk. An Argentine flash tore the sky. Benedicto Caldarella, a sunny talent with a wide smile, brought Gilera back into the headlines. Then, in '66, Remo Venturi raised the banner again, albeit only on Italian tracks. He fought like a lion, but the 500cc title slipped just beyond his grasp, won by a young man destined to rewrite history, Giacomo Agostini, on an MV. Giuseppe Boselli, who had surrendered to the logic of withdrawal, could not resist the call of racing for long. In '61, the flame was rekindled. With Francesco Villa, master of micromechanics and courage, he revived the old double cams and won 3 consecutive Italian titles in the 125 class. It was the dawn of a new cycle, which would continue with his younger brother Walter. Even two-strokes found a home in Mondial, bringing more glory, though in a more artisanal, intimate dimension. And Guzzi, the most faithful to the Pact, almost monastic, Having sold a double-cam single-cylinder to Giuseppe Mandolini, it no longer wanted to know about pure speed. No exceptions, no concessions. Only from 1969, under SIM management and with new men in charge, did it return to focus on records and endurance. But that was a different era, different dreams, different engines, different men. Thus ended in '57 the abstention Pact, a renunciation that today reads as an elegy for a lost opportunity. One can only imagine what might have happened if Moto Guzzi, Gilera and Mondial had continued to fight, pushing their ingenuity against the rising Japanese empire. Was it truly the Count who threw the first stone into the calm pond of racing? And was it perhaps MV Agusta who prepared the deception with white gloves and a noble smile? Voices chased each other like ghosts in the pits. Was it really Domenico Agusta, the great lord of Cascina Costa, who proposed the abstention, only to then slip away with the effortless lightness of one who commands and owes no explanations? But those who knew him well, who had breathed in his bursts of anger and rearing pride, knew he wasn't the type to throw a stone and then feign surprise at the splash. When the idea was cautiously, almost pleadingly presented to him, the Count reacted with the fury of a trained cyclone. "Why should we withdraw?" he exploded. "We started after the others, and now we're racing in 4 classes." It was a roar, not an answer. "That started after the others" was a sharp jab aimed at Gilera and Moto Guzzi, who had lived their golden years before the war when he was still crafting propellers and aluminum dreams. MV had come later, it's true, but now it was biting its way onto the stage. 125, 250, 350 and 500, a mechanical chariot ready for triumph. And precisely in that year, '57, when trophies slipped through fingers like sand, he had no intention of giving up. Pride burned hotter than results. Cancelling everything now would have meant confessing defeat. And Augusta, the Count, was no man to kneel before a crooked season. No, if the pact was signed, it was certainly not by his hand. He, to the very end, wanted to stay on the firing line with guns loaded and eyes fixed on victory, because to abandon the war without firing the last bullet was not in his blood. They could have stood alongside MV Agusta, challenged Ducati, prevented the Far East from becoming synonymous with motorcycling itself. But fate is also written with the words left unsaid, and some departures, just like some victories, are measured only in nostalgia. And so, today more than ever, we feel the duty to tell these stories, to bring them back to life between faded images and the roars of engines still echoing in the memories of those who were there. Because those bikes, those names, those champions have never really gone away. They remain here, suspended in time, like stars that keep shining even after they have exploded. And as long as there is someone willing to remember them, to linger on an old photo, to be moved by an overtaking now yellowed by memory, as long as there is a boy who fires up his first bike dreaming of Liberati's Gilera or the Ossobuco Guzzi, then the engine of history will never truly have stopped. And we, with voices broken but proud, will keep telling it, because myth doesn't need numbers. It only needs hearts willing to listen. Until the next episode of Wheels of History. For you, it's just a small gesture, but for us, it's essential to keep telling the stories of the men and machines that marked an era.